Hey everyone, thanks for joining me in session 235 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. I'm joined by doctors Jane, Howard, and Gina Green. And honestly, this is a podcast that could have gone on for several hours. We talked about a whole lot of things. We talked about what Gina has been up to since retiring from APBA. We talk about Jane's career in behavior analysis, including how she got in the field, some of her many accomplishments, including recently being honored as a fellow of ABAI, and what she's working on these days. We spent a bit of time talking about the basics of research design, including why some experimental questions lend themselves to certain designs over others. In this segment, we also covered group or between subjects designs and meta-analyses, which are relevant to understanding how to look at some of these some of these studies in the ABA outcome literature. We talk about the distinction between criterion and norm reference assessments, the number of initiatives and resources in the general realm of ABA treatment, including the current state of licensure, the ABA Coding Coalition, the Autism Commission on Quality, CASP. We go deep into that. We spent also some time talking about just epistemology more generally, critical thinking, how to be a healthy skeptic. And in addition to these topics, we probably spent the most amount of time discussing the empirical support for ABA interventions for individuals with autism. In doing so, we discussed the large research projects that Jane and Gina led. We talked about what to make of some of the criticisms of this literature that's starting to gain some notoriety, and what research questions we still need answers to. Jane and Gina mentioned numerous studies and resources. I've done my best to catalog them in the show notes for this episode. The show notes will definitely be your friend. This is probably the longest set of show notes I've ever had to write here. I've lost track of the number of entries. You can find those over at behavioralobservations.com. And I suppose while you're at it, while you're over there at behavioralobservations.com, just sign up for the email list, because I send all these show notes out, and so you can get them delivered right to your inbox. This podcast is brought to you by the following sponsors. We want to welcome a new sponsor to the show. The Michigan Autism Conference is taking place on October 11th to 13th in Kalamazoo, and it's also available online. We'll hear more about this event later on in the show. But if you're impatient like me, just go to michiganautismconference.org and use the code MAC10, that's MAC, the number 10, to save at checkout. And a little bit later on in the conference schedule, we've got the Stone Soup Conference coming up. You've heard me talk about the Stone Soup Conference in the past. We've got a great lineup again this year. That's taking place on October 20th. Use the code PODCAST at checkout to save on your registration. And last but not least, if you are in the job market, or if you're like every other employer out there, if you're looking for staff, you have to talk to Barbara Voss at HRIC Recruiting. Nobody knows the employment market in behavior analysis like Barb does. So just go to hricolorado.com and schedule a confidential chat with her right away. All right, that's it for opening remarks. I really hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. There's so much to learn here. So without any further delay, please enjoy this conversation with Doctors Howard and Green.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
All right, Doctors Gina Green and Jane Howard, thank you for joining us today on Behavioral Observations. This is a real honor. We've got so much to cover here in a short amount of time, and I think we probably have content for multiple podcasts. So we'll just see how far we get. But I'm really, really excited. And again, thanks for joining me today. So we want to talk all about the research base for applied behavior analysis. We were just chatting before we hit the record button here too about how to make these research findings practical to the everyday behavior analyst who's out there trying to do good work. But I wanted to, there's a couple of things I'd like to do before we get to that. Gina, I think when we chatted the last time, I think it was back on in session 33. My gosh, I can't believe it's been that long since you've been on the show. So that's failing on my part. So we're making up for it now. But I'd like you to catch us up on what's been going on with you in the years since you've been on the show. How everything's been going for you.
Sure. Well, thanks, man. I had to look it up and find out that episode was in 2017.
Oh my gosh.
So, yeah, I know. Hard to believe, time flies, whether you're having fun or not, right? And back then, that episode, we focused on licensure of behavior analysts. And of course, at the time, I was CEO of the Association of Professional Behavior Analysts, APBA. And part of the mission was advocating for public policies to support and advance the practice in our field. So in the years since then, I'm pleased and proud to say that thanks to collaborations involving APBA, several state behavior analysis associations, and our various allies and policymakers, 36 states, soon to be 37, have adopted laws to license behavior analysts. And that's important because it gives us recognition as a distinct profession. It gives behavior analysts a legislated scope of practice and provides protections for consumers as well as professionals. Another big accomplishment, I'd say, since the 2017 podcast in the area of public policy is a collaborative effort among several organizations to get the American Medical Association CPT editorial panel to upgrade the temporary CPT health insurance billing codes for ABA services to Category 1, and that signifies that the services are proven clinically effective based on research and are widely accepted in the healthcare community. Those codes went into effect on January 1 of 2019. In my role with APBA, we did lots of other public policy work, for example, on Medicaid and TRICARE and commercial health insurance policies on coverage of ABA, worked on various white papers and guidelines and position statements, and provided educational opportunities for behavior analysts and others as much as possible. In my spare time, which didn't exist, I was also really honored to be the co-author of the 4th edition of Strategies and Tactics of Behavioral Research and Practice with Jim Johnston and Hank Pennypacker. I kind of worked on that on weekends and holidays. It took way longer than my great friend Jim Johnston would have preferred, but we got it done, and it was published in 2020. Some folks may know that I retired from the APBA position late last year, but I'm continuing to work in the profession. I'm doing some consulting and then volunteer work with the ABA Coding Coalition, which advocates for correct implementation of those CPT codes. The Autism Commission on Quality, which is a relatively new nonprofit organization that accredits autism provider organizations. Mission Alpha Advocacy, which is another fairly new nonprofit organization for military parents of children with autism. So that kind of wraps up where I am right now.
That's an interesting perspective on retirement, I should say.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of cool stuff. So, so Dr. Jane Howard, I've been looking forward to chatting with you. I'm going to break an editorial rule here. Whenever I have multiple guests on the show, I always kind of skip the how'd you get into ABA and stuff like that, just because with multiple guests, we have lots to get into. I'm going to break that rule right now, though, because I want to know more, and I'd like the audience more particularly to learn more about you if they're not familiar. So I'd like to know a little bit about your background. How did you get into this line of work, and tell us what you're doing these days.
Well, I was one of those kids that when people would ask, what do you want to be when you grow up? Starting from the age of 6 or 7, I would say, I want to be a psychologist. And it's not as if I really understood what that meant, but I just knew that people were really interesting. Situations were really interesting. Learning was really interesting. And my parents had subscribed to this Time Life series called The Mind. And it was a wonderful journey. And you're like third or fourth grade, to go through and read about all the different theories and approaches to understanding human behavior, even down to the sort of biological level. So when I got to college, there was no question in my mind. I knew I was going to major in psychology, and I took intro class my very first semester there. I was at Mount Holyoke, and that turns out to be a big part of this story. The intro class was wonderful, but I also had this feeling as I was going through the various chapters in the textbook that these are kind of more like stories that people are telling. It's not the science that I kind of envisioned. But part of this intro psych class at Mount Holyoke had an animal learning lab in it that was taught by Ellie Reese and run by Ellie Reese students. So in my very first semester there, I was teaching pigeons to read the words peck and turn and do exactly what it said on the card. And I would say from that moment on, I knew what I was going to be doing with my life in some fashion. I think that's a story that a lot of us have had. And then when I finished my undergrad, I went on to get my master's and doctorate at Western Michigan with the fabled faculty who were there, and had an amazing experience. But ended up when I finished taking a 1-year teaching sabbatical to replace somebody who was going on sabbatical in one of the state universities in California. But of course, it turned out to be 37 years that I was there instead of 1. And in the meantime, besides having a wonderful opportunity to really help build the master's program in behavior analysis at Cal State Stanislaus, I got involved with CalABA when CalABA wasn't even a CalABA. And then also with Colleen Sparkman, a speech and language pathologist here, we started an autism treatment program that has grown into 6 centers, including 2 that specialize in the treatment of severe behavior. And this past year, we formed a partnership with Trumpet Behavioral Health to be able to find a bigger platform for the clinical infrastructure and systems that we've developed. And in addition to that, I had an opportunity to be part of the BACB Board of Directors, and in that context, help shepherd the first practice guidelines. And lately, my activities have been directed towards CASP, the Council for Autism Service Providers, and I'm a founding member and a board of director there. So that's all the professional stuff. We'll have to go to another podcast for me to tell you about what's going on in my personal life, so we'll stop there.
That would be stay tuned, folks. That'd be a fun part too. Yeah. 1 year to 37 years. I think that's pretty nowhere. That was pretty
hilarious. That's what I told my parents. I'm just going for a year. So anyway.
Yeah, it's a bit of a rounding error, I guess. Are you looking to expand your knowledge, connect with a like-minded community, and accrue those CEUs you've been meaning to catch up on? Well, look no further. Mark your calendars for the 11th Annual Michigan Autism Conference, October 11th through 13th, 2023, in downtown Kalamazoo, Michigan, where we will be planting seeds of change for tomorrow's growth. Our 2023 speaker lineup features keynote speakers Shala Alai Rosales, Rita Gardner, Darnell Latal, John McCacken, Trina Spencer, and Jason Travers, along with over 50 breakout sessions as well. We even have pre-conference workshops and a free kickoff event prior to the main conference. CEU packages are available for BCBAs, social workers, educators, and beyond. Be sure to save your spot as early registration discounts end August 18th, 2023. Interested in learning more? Check us out at michiganautismconference.org to see the 2023 lineup, past conference archives, and much more. We're still accepting caregiver scholarship applications and have virtual ticket options available for those who are interested. And as an exclusive for Behavioral Observations listeners, use code MAC10, that's MAC, the number 10, for $10 off your conference registration. We can't wait for you to join us. So let's talk about I want to talk about the kind of, I don't know, the nuts and bolts of the existing research base on applied behavior analysis. And in doing so, I'd like to take a few steps back and actually get your guys' thoughts on not just what we know, but how we know what we know. I've always been one of those people to ask the question, well, how do you know that? And it's one of those things, and especially these days where it seems like there's lots of information out there and things like that. We can get to that piece momentarily, but I guess from your perspective, what is a good, I guess, for lack of a better term, I always struggle with this word, epistemological framework, if you will, or for folks to kind of understand, whether it's the ABA research base as it relates to treating individuals with autism, but just more generally, what have you guys? You guys have done lots and lots of research and scholarship as well as practice. So I'm curious what your point of, and I imagine you developed a point of view on this. So again, how do we know what we know about this stuff that we do as behavior analysts?
Those are great questions, Matt. And it's not a coincidence. I think that question, how do you know that, is something I view as absolutely central. So it's great that you preempted me, because that was kind of in my prep notes. And I think that what, the sort of underlying repertoire, that foundational repertoire that we all need just to be good, informed citizens and consumers, is what I'd call healthy skepticism or critical thinking. And by that, I don't mean that you just reject everything out of hand. Some people think that's what skepticism means, or that you're cynical about everything. That's really not the case. It just means that whenever you hear any kind of assertion or claim that could affect, your well-being, that of the people you love, the clients you serve, or society at large, you ask that basic question: how do you know that? And then you do the best you can to find out is there objective evidence behind that claim or that assertion. I think my skepticism, which I think was I already had a fair amount in my repertoire, really was sharpened and honed back in the late 1990s, when we were contending with facilitated communication and many other really pseudoscientific, anti-scientific interventions that just seemed to crop up endlessly in autism. I got very involved with that. But I think it's even more important today that we all be good, healthy skeptics and critical thinkers, because we're in an age when misinformation and disinformation just spreads like wildfire, via social media. We have, artificial intelligence now looming, where we have apps like ChatGPT and some others that I don't begin to understand, but that allow the creation of text and audio material and video material that can look authentic and seem real, seem genuine, but it's fake. And it gets, I think, harder and harder in this, age also of science denial and outright denial of objective facts, for us to make those discriminations. And so that's the one area that I would urge all behavior analysts, if they haven't already, learned critical thinking skills to develop those. There's good course material out. There are some universities actually teach classes in this. I'm not sure it's being taught in a lot of behavior analysis programs, but I wish it were.
Gina, I used to think that the parents of children with autism had this enormous task of sorting through all the information on the internet, trying to figure out what interventions to select for their child, and trying to understand what was best. But I think your point, the reality is it's now a real challenge, I think, for practitioners to sort through. You mentioned what you see on social media or artificial intelligence, but also just discriminating how our science gets built, and that what they may hear at a single conference presentation or something like that, they still have to sort through that. So, I mean, I think I agree with you. The challenge is really there, and hopefully we can encourage people to arm themselves with the skills they need. So, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but when we were talking about it, we're harking back to what the parents were dealing with, and now the clinicians.
That's a fantastic
and I think that speaks to the, or what you implied there is that, understanding that of how science works and how science develops and accumulates knowledge, and it's incremental. It doesn't happen overnight. There's no single study that's going to answer all the questions that a parent might have or that practitioners have. And so that kind of segues into, I think, our next topic, depending on Matt's plan here.
Yeah, well, that is an excellent segue because I want to talk about there's been many studies looking at behavior analytic interventions, particularly for children with autism. And you guys have done some, published some of the major papers in that, I guess, canon of research. So I want to definitely give you guys an opportunity to talk about that, but also put that in the context of the existing research base as well. And then after that, I want to talk a little bit about some of the, the challenges or the criticisms that people typically lodge against this body of work. But let's establish the body of work first, then we can go from there. So what do we know as it relates to in other words, what does the existing body of research say about the treatment of individuals with autism using behavior analytic techniques, I guess, writ large?
And I'd like to kind of set the table for this by providing sort of broad context about the kind of research that we can hang our hats on, the kinds of studies that produce evidence that we can be confident about, and then get into sort of an overview of the big picture on ABA interventions. But as I said, there's no single study that can answer questions. I mean, a good research study is going to answer one, maybe two questions. And, we have lots and lots of interventions. It's not like, contrary to sort of popular belief, if you will, that it's a single treatment or a single therapy. And, we address a very wide range of behaviors. So I think a point I would really like to make to practitioners, to emphasize to practitioners, is to look for really good systematic reviews and meta-analyses of data from multiple studies, not any single study. And the kinds of studies that should be included or that you should see analyzed in a good review or meta-analysis have certain features. They're controlled studies, meaning that there's an arrangement of comparisons of a control condition and a treatment condition, or maybe treatment A and treatment B, and many variations on that. And the way you arrange those comparisons depends on the research question. The kind of research design used depends on the research question. So if you're wanting to answer what I consider big actuarial questions, like on average, how do the effects of this treatment compare to no treatment or typical services, then you need a group design study where you have one group of participants who are assigned to receive the treatment, another very similar group that does not get the treatment or maybe gets a different one. You measure the behavior or the biology of interest that we call the dependent variable in research with all those participants at the beginning. Then the treatment group gets the treatment of interest for some period of time while the control group doesn't. I'm very simplifying this, but measure again at the end of the study. And then typically, again, a bit oversimplifying here, the researchers will take the aggregated group data. So the average score of the treatment group and the average score of the control group, for example, on the measure, let's say, of behavior change, and they compare those aggregated data statistically. If the result meets certain rules for statistical significance, then generally the conclusion is that difference was not due to chance. And then you kind of go from there. Well, it must then have been due to the treatment and not something else. But if you're asking questions about how environmental events affect behavior, which is, of course, the subject matter of our field, then you need a different kind of conceptualization and methodology to do your research, what we call single case research designs. And of course, each participant experiences the treatment and the control conditions. They're arranged to be replicated, those conditions, hopefully multiple times. There are lots of ways to do those replications or to arrange them. And then, of course, we're measuring behavior frequently, repeatedly by direct observation, hopefully using good measurement methods, graphing those data, and then looking at the overall patterns of the data in the treatment and control conditions to draw a conclusion that any change we see in the treatment conditions over the control, which we often call the baseline condition, must be due to the intervention and not something else. So those are just two very broad kind of types of research designs. There are lots of combinations and hybrids and variations. Another feature of good studies on treatment effects, any kind of treatment, is that they're prospective, meaning they start at a point in time and they go forward in real time. Another is that the researchers use good methods for measuring the effects of the treatment. Again, could be any kind of treatment, so that the data they get are objective and accurate and valid and reliable. And in our world, in the general world of autism interventions, let's say, it's necessary to use appropriate standardized assessment instruments. These are instruments that are administered and scored and interpreted in a uniform and consistent way, always, no matter who is administering it, no matter who the participant is. Those kinds of assessments can be criterion referenced, where a participant score is compared to some predetermined criterion or standard, a passing score, a certain proficiency level of performance, or they can be norm referenced, where the individual score is compared to the scores previously obtained of a group of people, typically of the same age, chronological age. There are really well-established standards for developing and evaluating standardized assessment instruments. They're put out periodically by the American Educational Research Association, the American Psychological Association, and the National Council on Measurement and Education, collaboratively. So, having said that, those are the features of again, good, sound research studies. If we see reports from evaluations that don't have those features, I would recommend taking those reported results with several grains of salt. That will include evaluations where there's no control or comparison condition. One example, I know, Matt, you brought this up in an email, is evaluations that have been conducted by officials with the TRICARE, the Autism Care Demonstration, that's the military insurance, no control group or comparison there. I would urge caution in interpreting any sort of retrospective reviews of data or clinical records of recipients, especially if there are not specific kinds of controls for those kinds of evaluations. I'd be cautious about any study that used only one outcome measure. We're talking here in autism about a population of people who, we know there are multiple domains that are affected. And so you need measurement of all of those that may be affected by treatment. And they need to be a combination, I'd say, of direct measures of client behavior, as well as indirect measures, reports from caregivers, like the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scale, very commonly used measure, but that's a caregiver report. And so it's subjective, valuable, but subjective rather than objective.
Well, can I just make a comment here? I just think you kind of succinctly ran through that's probably one of the shortest courses in research design, but very, very, and I know you were truncating things for the purpose of time, but I just had to observe there and point out that was very well done in terms of running through all the, a lot of the major high points of what people should look out for and know about when they're looking at various types of publications. So I just appreciate that.
I wanted to hit that because I think it's really germane to these, some of the issues that practitioners are facing, and that how do we know, our code of ethics says we need to look at the best available scientific evidence and make our recommendations and treatment decisions based on that evidence. Well, how do we know what kind of evidence we can kind of be confident and hang our hat on?
And if I may blurt in one more time here, Gina, I'm sorry, but I would also say that that it's another reason why that's important to draw those distinctions is to perhaps, just because something's published doesn't mean it meets all those standards that you just outlined. And I think there are a number of things here where we have a population of practitioners who aren't engaged in clinical research, and that's perfectly fine. Sure. You go to your primary care physician; they're not doing clinical research. It's so I'm not saying that as a value judgment or anything like that. It's perfectly appropriate. And so, and again, as someone who's been in the practice, I've always been in practice. I've never been a researcher. I think for those of us on the outside looking in, there's this magical property of submitting something to a journal and having it published that bestows it with some level of credibility. Yeah. And so I just have to marvel at how quickly you went through some of those standards that people can more critically evaluate what's out there, even if it is published in a journal and has the everything that goes along with the peer review process. So again, I apologize for blurting in there, but I just couldn't let that pass without comment.
No, and it really does depend on the journal. And I think another complication is that, there's all kinds of journals now. Some I don't think there really is much peer review. There are what are called pay-to-play journals, where if you pay them, they publish your paper, apparently. I haven't published there, thank goodness, but I hear that those things exist. So yeah, that's, it adds, I think, to the challenge, but for practitioners and others. But again, there's some pretty clear sorts of standards and guidelines. And I had mentioned that, we can't just look at the results of any single study. So I would really encourage practitioners, again, to look for good systematic reviews and meta-analyses. A meta-analysis combines data from multiple studies, hopefully methodologically good studies of the same intervention. And that allows them then to calculate some important metrics, often called effect sizes, that indicate the magnitude of change that's produced by an intervention, and maybe also the magnitude of change or absence thereof for the alternative intervention or the no treatment. And meta-analyses can be done on group design studies and also on single case research designs. There's been tremendous development in methodologies for aggregating data across single case research designs. Of course, that gives us bigger numbers, and that allows us to make stronger conclusions about the general effects of an intervention. So we do have a number of meta-analyses of data, mostly from group design studies, what are often called behavioral interventions or early intensive behavioral interventions for young children with autism, that have been published in the last 20 years or so. Now, some of those you got to be careful because they conflate behavior analytic and non-behavior analytic methods, lump them all together under behavioral. Some have been restricted to studies using what are called randomized clinical trials, where participants randomly assigned to treatment and control groups, et cetera. And so they've just, missed out and excluded a lot of relevant evidence. But we do have some good ones that have clearly defined the treatment as ABA, and the treatment that was used in the studies, again, group design studies, and aggregated and analyzed those data. Folks can find references to a lot of those in the bibliography of a model coverage policy for health insurance that the ABA Coding Coalition has developed. It's about ABA services for anybody with any diagnosis for whom they're medically necessary. And also a clarifications follow-up on the then existing ASD treatment guidelines that the BACB and APBA published a few years ago. People can find both of those documents on the Coding Coalition website, which is just abacodes.org. In particular, I would encourage people to take a look at two meta-analyses that use individual data on participants, hundreds of them, who were involved in these multiple studies. The reason that's important is because it gives you a more fine-grained and precise kind of analysis than a more typical meta-analysis would take the reported group averages and group standard deviations and so on. But these two meta-analyses both, did a good job of making sure the interventions had the defining characteristics of ABA, and they got individual data redacted directly from researchers. That's a meta-analysis by Sigmund Eldevik and colleagues, published in 2010 in the American Journal on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, and then one by Clintwall and colleagues, published in the journal Autism in 2015. And just to stop rambling for a minute and get back to one of your questions, Matt, what those good meta-analyses show is that intensive ABA intervention for at least 30 hours a week for at least a couple of years is much more likely to produce large and clinically meaningful improvements in most young children with autism than mixed method intervention and lower intensity ABA intervention and typical early intervention services. There are also meta-analyses, a lot of them now, of focused ABA interventions. So just a few techniques addressing a few target behaviors, maybe a challenging behavior or two, and some alternative adaptive behavior. Those are also in the bibliography of the model coverage policy. There's really good protocols for evaluating evidence from both group designs and single case designs, including 2 reviews now that have been done by a clearinghouse on autism evidence at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina. Those are published, they're available. So I'd encourage folks to look at those because they really lay out the evidence for ABA and other interventions for people with autism across the age span.
Are you looking for a new job, but you're overwhelmed with all the emails that you're getting from various ABA agencies? What if there was someone who was in your corner and could help you find the perfect job placement? Well, that person exists. Barbara Voss has been working as a recruiter for over 30 years, and her company, HRIC, specializes in placing BCBAs in permanent full-time positions throughout the United States. Barbara has been placing BCBAs since 2011, so she knows our business, and she offers personalized service to any BCBA looking for a new position. She also helps companies looking to hire BCBAs too. Here are just some of the things Barbara can help you with. She can provide information about salary ranges in different markets across the country. She can help you write your resume. She can coordinate and prepare you for the interview process, and even help negotiate the right salary for you. And best of all, there are no charges to any candidate for all of these services. When you are ready to make a change and want to work with someone who will listen to you and understand what you need in a new position, contact Barbara at HRIC. To schedule a confidential discussion, head over to hricolorado.com. Again, that's hricolorado.com, and hit the contact button to connect with Barbara. You won't be disappointed. I see. That's what was that last one there? From UNC.
It's called the National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence and Practice. It's housed in the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina. And that group has brought together big teams, multidisciplinary teams, twice now, to do a comprehensive review of evidence on mostly on focused interventions of all kinds for people with autism. I said the whole lifespan. Their reviews have covered children, adolescents, and young adults. I think they've only gone up to about age 21. Very, very well done, and very comprehensive and useful.
Okay, so I will just note for the listener, this is going to be an episode where the show notes are going to be your friend, and I'll be running down all the links
send you the info
and make sure that they're in the show notes. And I'll just put in a plug to sign up for the email list, because I do send the show notes out to subscribers, so you don't have to go to the website. You could just get them sent right to your inbox. So thank you for that clarification. And so this will be, again, a resource-rich page of show notes for sure. So I appreciate you guys coming in with lots and lots of information to this podcast recording.
Jane has a lot to add here, I think, illustrating some of the points that I just made about the kinds of studies that, again, I think we can be confident in.
Yeah, I'd like to share a little bit about our work, and Gina is actually there are actually 3 studies. Not everyone is always aware that there were 3 studies, but Gina was the co-author along with Harold Stanislaw and Colleen Sparkman and Howard Cohen on the first 2 that were published in the Journal of Developmental Disabilities. And then there was a 3rd one that we published in 2019 in the Journal of the American Association of Nurse Practitioners, which had some additional participants in it. And in that study, in that article, we wanted to try and present the information so that a healthcare specialist who might be working with families would be able to understand a little bit more about what the research was. But basically, these were studies in early interventions. So we were taking relatively young children with diagnoses of autism. And the group that was receiving intensive ABA was being treated in centers and at home by the staff at Therapeutic Pathways, which is the organization that I co-founded some time ago. But and I'll tell you a little bit about the other groups, the comparison groups. They were comprised of children who were receiving services that would be probably considered very specialized, individualized for children with autism, trying to address all different kinds of domains, but they did it by incorporating treatment approaches from many different philosophies. So there was a little bit of teach that they received as part of their intervention. They received some discrete trial training. There were behavior analysts that were working with the children at the time, and they also were getting pull-out speech therapy and occupational therapy. So it was really going across a whole gamut of services that are typically provided and maybe in a very comprehensive way and at a level of intensity that was comparable to the number of treatment hours that the children who were receiving ABA were getting. There was yet a third group that was composed of children who were in somewhat larger groups, because the first two that I talked about, ABA and then the specialized autism programming, were receiving essentially one-on-one services for most of the time. In this third group, there were children with other kinds of disabilities, maybe Down syndrome or things, other disorders besides autism, and they were in a sort of group format that was designed to be more like a typical preschool or early intervention kindergarten. And actually the teachers, if you will, in that program were speech and language pathologists. So it was a very language kind of based approach. And the children this was not a random assignment. I don't know who is able to do random assignment for treatment A, B, and C when you're talking about young children with autism. But the parents did have the choice of which program they wanted their children to be placed in. And one of the things that I appreciated so much about that arrangement was that the parents were really talked about. Here's this option, here's this option, here's this option. And, if you will, a little bit about the cost benefit analysis of each. So the children ended up in the programs that their caregivers, their parents, had chosen for them. And before anybody was very far along in treatment, I think the criteria was something like less than 6 months, there was a complete battery of standardized assessment devices, instruments that were administered by individuals who were not associated with any one of the treatment programs. So these were contractors that worked for the regional center, and they weren't affiliated with any program. And to Gina's point, when she's talking about multiple measures, autism is such a complex condition that may impact so many domains, cognitive, social, behavioral, so on language, on and on and on. So they received, the children in this program, in these 3 programs, received an assessment that was appropriate for their age and ability and cognition. Often it was the Bailey scales of infant development, but there were others that were reliable, validated assessments. They also received an assessment of their receptive and expressive language abilities, communication abilities, and the Vineland was also administered to their caregivers. And these assessments were repeated on an annual basis for up to 3 years. And actually, some in the 2019 study had more than 3 data points. So on average, the first assessment was administered 14 months into treatment, something like that. The second one was like 27 months into treatment, and the third one was 38 months. Now, one of the points that Gina made early on was it doesn't have to be random assignment, okay, as long as you are confident that, which of course we can't do random assignment for the most part, but as long as you're confident that the groups are equivalent. So we really took a look at all kinds of things. What age were they diagnosed? What age were they when they first started treatment? What were their parents like? In terms of racial and ethnic makeup. What was the parent level of education? And when we looked across those variables, there was really only one or two that there was some difference, and we ended up controlling for them statistically. One was that the children in the ABA group were diagnosed somewhat younger than the children in the other groups. My suspicion is that maybe they were diagnosed, I don't know, maybe they were diagnosed younger because they had been showing more developmental delay. I don't really know. We have no way of sorting that out. But the other variable was that the parents of the children who chose ABA program, their mothers on average had 2 additional years of education over the parents in the other group. So those variables were partialed out so that essentially we could be confident that the groups were equivalent. So children who were in the ABA program first started out with, if they were under 3, it would be under 25 hours a week. As they aged, the hours would be increased. First started out in one-on-one sessions, but then expanded into small group learning. We were in the community with them. We went to preschool with them. We were everywhere that they were. And so the goals, the treatment goals for the children really changed over time as we were getting better at closing the gap between them and what their typically developing peers were doing in social situations, in self-help situations, in communications settings. So the goals were adjusting as we were on our way. And we clearly looked very carefully at these data that were coming back to us, not just the data from each session, which of course are very important in terms of making changes to clinical program, but we would also take stock, let's say at year 2, how are we doing in terms of closing the vocabulary and language gap? What other things might we need to be thinking about? I would encourage anybody who's really interested to go and read the original sources here, and Matt will put those in the show notes as well, right? But at the bottom line is that children, after all is said and done, children in the intensive ABA group were twice as likely to start scoring in the normal range on all these critical measures as were any of the children in either the autism program specific or the more generic special education. And in our year 3 publication, the one that came out in 2014, one of the things that we really emphasized looking at was how the children were performing on measures of adaptive skills, and that would be the Vineland, and as well as intellectual functioning, because those two domains are so important. Not only do they have to do with diagnosing any kind of intellectual disability, but they really are predictive about what life is going to be like for that individual as they age forward. It's not any guarantee, but they are pretty good predictors. So when we looked at our year 3 outcome data, we saw at the beginning of treatment, about 85% of the children in all 3 groups were scoring more than 2 standard deviations below the mean in both adaptive skills and cognitive skills. If that's your baseline, if that's where you're taking, starting from in terms of treatment, you've got some significant ground to cover in order to start closing the gaps with your same age peers. And that means that you have to be so thoughtful about every minute of treatment, every minute that you're out of treatment, and how you're spending your resources and your time. What we did see that at the end of 3 years, when we looked at the same 3 groups of kids, okay, now, remember, I said at the beginning, 85% of the children in each group were below two standard deviations or more below in both adaptive and intellectual functioning. 3 years later, when we looked at those groups of children who did not receive intensive ABA, and remember, the children in the autism specific program did get about 10 hours of discrete trial each week, but what we saw was that about 72% of those children are still more than 2 standard deviations below the mean in both adaptive and cognitive functioning. When we turn and we look at the children in the ABA group, not everybody progressed to the normal range, but only about 30% of the kids in the ABA services were scoring below 2 standard deviations in both intellectual and cognitive functioning. Compare that with the 72% that are in the other groups, and they're still scoring below. And I think it's also just a stark reminder that specifically when we start talking about early intervention, time is not your friend. You don't get back that the hours of intervention to change children's trajectories, which is why it's so important that behavior analysts, when they're talking with families about treatment options and they're trying to work out the schedule, and it's complicated and there are a lot of competing activities, that they also need to be able to talk to them about what the risk is for enduring intellectual disability, communication impairment, and problems in self-help into not just today, next year, but 2 years from now, 12 years from now, so forth and so on. And I think that's a conversation we want to have highlighted with our practitioners to be able to talk with families about what the data tell us and about how it can help inform decision-making.
Hey everyone, last commercial of this podcast. I want to tell you about the Stone Soup Conference. It's coming up on October 20th, 2023 by our friends at Lake Ridge Community Support Services. This is a fun event. They always get lots of great speakers. I'm going to be interviewing some of them coming up. I'm looking at some of the speakers here. My friends Polly Gavoni and Anika Costa, they'll be doing what they call a talk on Tough Talks, Overcoming Performance Challenges. And we're going to be doing a podcast on that topic as well. So we'll get some a sneak peek, if you will, in terms of what they'll be talking about. We have some Stone Soup alumni like Merrill Winston, Florence DeGennaro-Reed, and others. And I could go on, lots and lots of great presentations for you. So if you want to learn more, you can go to lrcss.com/Stone Soup, or you can just go to the show notes for this episode. I'll have a link to it right at the bottom. And when you do sign up for the event, just use the promo code podcast to save at registration. I hope to see you there. All right, let's get back to the rest of this interview. That last point, I think, is kind of gets to a question that occurred to me earlier in the conversation, and that, and I suppose I have the luxury of looking at this from afar because my work is not in early intervention, and oftentimes not with individuals with autism either. But obviously, I pay a lot of attention to this just because of the field that we're in and so forth. And I have many friends and colleagues who wrestle with this all the time. And so you kind of answered my question that I was going to ask about, like, what as a practitioner and a parent just coming to you say, I don't have X number of hours that you're recommending here, and things like that. How do you respond to that? It's so hard. It's one of those things where, like, you're in the position, it seems like, and you correct me if I don't have this correct, but it's one of those situations where there's no easy answers. You can't say, oh, well, well, let's just do 5 hours or 10 hours, and it'll be proportionally good. Yeah, it's just really tough. I don't know. It's more of a comment than a question, I suppose, Jane. And but it's a very, very important point, and I don't know. It's and again, my heart breaks for the parents, and certainly for the clinicians out there who are caught in this, in this scenario here.
You're right. There is no easy answer here, and I don't think there's even a single answer. But I will say that I know parents are trying to do the very best thing that they can for their children. It's that is at the heart of everything that they do. But I do think we as professionals can really help that process along by having some frank conversations about what the data show, and also what we don't know, making sure that we acknowledge that. But I think this is never just one conversation. This is about coming back to the family on multiple occasions, understanding what's going on in their lives, trying to make it easier or more feasible, at least, to engage more robustly in the therapy process. And I think that's the piece that I hope that we can encourage the practitioners who already have so many things to do, and as do our families. They're wrestling with their other children, their jobs, economics, all that. They've got a lot. But this obligation, I think, it needs to be one that probably gets a little more prominence and perhaps support for the clinicians who are having these conversations with the family, because it really is, it is challenging. So you're right. I don't think there's one answer, and I don't think it's easily solved, but I think I am confident if we keep at it, that we'll be able to give more children the opportunity to be free of intellectual or any sort of deficits. And I think we have to have that conversation, and we have to be able to say, if you were to ask a parent, okay, would you like treatment A or B? And this might be putting it a little crudely, but if this treatment has less than a 30% chance of your child ending up with a normal cognitive and communicative ability, and this one has maybe 70%. I'm not saying that's exactly how it turns out. That at least should be something that's on the radar, I think. I don't know. People may disagree with that.
It's been, I think too, I can't remember how you displayed the data in that. Was it the 05 paper? It was either in a bar graph, or it might have been in a table. But what I do, it's been a little bit since I looked at that paper, but the outcome data, regardless of how it was displayed, very quickly you can ascertain the difference between the groups. It's and you don't have to have much background and you don't have to be a co-author on strategies and tactics to pick up the effects. You can glance at that. Again, I can't remember if it was a table or a chart, but and so that the results from that work were obvious, even to perhaps someone who's not trained on evaluating research. So,
and that's actually one of the things that we've been trying to work on here, is how do you communicate some of that in ways that are friendly to caregivers who are not researchers, scientists. And I don't think we've got it totally solved, but we've been focused on that. Yeah. Gina, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in. I think this kind of circles back to some of the framing of this whole topic that you provided at the beginning, Matt, and underscored some of what Jane's saying. And that is, behavior analysts, we say we are an evidence-based field. We say we are a science-based field. Evidence-based practice actually originated in medicine. And the term is used in a lot of different ways now, so there's got to be cautious about that. But the most widely accepted, if you will, definition of evidence-based practice is that whether any discipline, medicine, other healthcare, behavioral, it means you start with the best available scientific evidence. So, and you look at that evidence to tell you, if I recommend or prescribe a certain intervention for my client or patient, what are the chances? What are the probabilities? The best we know, Jane was alluding to this, of what the outcomes for that patient might be. So when you go to your physician and they diagnose you with some condition, hopefully, if they're ethical and they're well-informed, they're going to say, well, this is the treatment that I recommend, and here's how it's likely to affect you. If there's another one, they might say, well, there's this other treatment, and here's what we know about what that's likely to do. And then they they individualize that, right, to your particular characteristics. And more in medicine, there's an emphasis as they learn about DNA and so on of really individualizing treatments to each person's biology, and their, even things like the dosage, it's going to depend on your height and your weight and your age and lots of other things. So I think that's what we're talking about here. Is I would like to see behavior analysts think about that. You tell parents, as Jane is recommending, here's what we know is the most likely to produce these outcomes. If you choose to do something else, this is what we know. Best evidence we have right now is likely to happen. And then you work on individualizing that to the family circumstances and the individual and so on as best you can. It's not an easy task, but if we're going to continue to say we are an evidence-based field, then we got to stick to that.
I see. All right. We could talk about this for a long time here, yep. But I'd be remiss if we didn't get to the next topic that I want to get into. It's related, of course, and it has to do with the criticisms of the research base for behavior analytic treatment. There are criticisms of the research base that you could find on, online and social media, whatever. That there's going to be plenty of that. There's probably a never-ending supply of that. But I'm talking criticisms that perhaps may, being lodged by other people who are, in academia, who are researchers in their own fields and things like that. And these are things like, and this may not be an exhaustive list, but these are things like some things that have been brought up are, okay, none of these or very few of these studies are a true randomized controlled trial. I know you guys touched on that, but I'd like to just circle back to that and make sure we really nail the understanding of what that is, why it may or may not be relevant here, and so forth. There are, no one's monitoring for side effects of the interventions or, iatrogenic effects or what have you. Another fancy research term I have trouble pronouncing. Conflicts of interest, things along those lines. So I'd like to get your thoughts on these kind of these criticisms from the research community that have been lodged against this body of work, and how might folks think through those challenges.
Well, of course, I'm happy to talk about this. Love talking about research. I've read a lot of reviews and a lot of analyses, and a lot of these criticisms kind of had to in the context of public policy work and other tasks. And, I think we need to kind of step back and realize there's no body of research that's perfect. You can criticize, research from every discipline. One of the things that's puzzled me about some of the reviews of research, behavior analytic researcher that included research in ABA methods, is that the review teams don't have anybody with expertise in behavior analysis or behavior analytic research methods on the team. And as a result, it's really frustrating to read misrepresentations of the science, of the discipline, and of the research. And, the one upshot of that is that you have people who come from the traditional group designs with statistical comparisons of group averages and other metrics, and they try to apply that kind of the standards of that kind of research to our single case research designs, not understanding they're conceptually, methodologically different, subject matters are different, research questions are different. On the randomization, what random assignment to treatment and control groups is supposed to produce is groups that are not different from one another at the beginning of the treatment on any variables that might bias the ultimate results one way or the other. But randomized assignment doesn't always achieve that. And there are other ways to do that. As Jane alluded to in our studies, you can empirically evaluate the equivalence of the groups at the beginning, and there are control methods, statistical control methods for differences that I don't begin to understand, but that can be brought to bear there. That said, there are some randomized clinical trials of early intensive ABA. There are some randomized clinical trials of more focused ABA treatments. I think another thing that puzzles me about some of the reviews and criticisms I see that, they look only at randomized clinical trials of group design, so they sort of exclude and discount a very large body of research using different kinds of designs that can produce good evidence about effects. And they seem to not be tuned in to the many criticisms of randomized clinical trials and group designs more generally that have been coming from leaders in evidence-based medicine, for example, who've been advocating for what they call N of 1 studies, looking at the effects of interventions on individual participants. They're basically talking about our withdrawal designs. Concerns that, group statistics aren't going to tell you how the individuals responded or didn't to treatment. Random assignment, when you're talking about interventions for behaviors that put people at risk, ethical and practical considerations about randomly assigning people to no treatment or to a treatment that you're pretty sure isn't going to be very effective. So there's that concern. With any sort of group design study, and Jane and I have done a few of these, you've got big challenges. You've got to find sufficient numbers of people to make up the treatment and comparison groups. They got to be really similar to one another. You have to keep them in those groups, most of them, for the duration of the study in order to make sense of what happens. So when you're talking about treatments that are trying to, we're comprehensive, again, you're addressing multiple domains, and then we know it has to go for long periods of time. Behavior does not change overnight. I think those are some very good reasons why it's challenging to do any kind of group design of that kind, particularly, again, random assignment. And you'll find lots of people from psychology, for example, who've noted problems with randomized clinical trials. The conditions in a randomized clinical trial may not bear any resemblance to the everyday situations in which our patients or clients find themselves. So there is a generality issue. And it may be why, there may be other reasons why there are not a lot of replications of randomized clinical trials. And psychology, for example, has been talking about the crisis of failures to replicate findings in psychology about psychological interventions, for example. Maybe one of the reasons, because of all those complications of doing randomized clinical trials, makes it that much harder to replicate those studies. We can talk about the claims about bias and other issues in our research in a minute, but if Jane has something to add to that.
No, I would just say it in some ways, the controlled studies, similar to what we did, is it's still challenging, but it's much more feasible, especially when you're talking about behavioral health treatments or anything. It's not taking medication for 6 weeks or something like that. It's when it comes to evaluating behavioral health treatments, I think you really have to look for some alternatives to RCTs.
And then, there are several different kinds of designs. And, one of the things I've noticed in RCTs of ABA-focused treatments, as well as some other autism treatments, is their short duration.
They're short.
And they're targeting, 1 or 2 or 3 behaviors. Not comprehensive, not going to give us information about long-term effects of the likelihood of, an intervention producing really meaningful changes in the person's overall functioning. But they're given a lot of weight because of this belief that the RCT is the so-called gold standard and nothing else is good enough.
Gina, I don't know that we're going to be able to explore this now, but I think another really important conversation for clinicians, and not to have just the conversation with clinicians, but what constitutes meaningful change? What are outcomes that are really going to be impactful in terms of that individual's life and their family's life. And I think that's an area we have to come back and pay some more attention to and give our practitioners some support. You can have an outcome that is statistically significant from a probability standpoint that has absolutely no meaning in terms of altering the quality of somebody's life or that trajectory. So the fact that you have statistically significant outcomes doesn't in any way begin to address, is that a meaningful difference? Is that a meaningful change? And so Gina and I were actually talking about this earlier today. One of the things that I've been interested in following Sigmund Eldovic's work, and Gina cited the individual participant data analysis that they did in 2010. And by the way, they're coming out with another one, which I'm really looking forward to, that I think will be published this summer. They use the Reliable Change Index as a measure. It's a very stringent measure as to whether or not you can attribute a change in performance to a treatment and whether or not that's likely to be a really significant change. So this is a bigger conversation, but I think starting to have that get more prominence and giving clinicians some of the support and tools they need in order to talk about what are meaningful outcomes for families and for individuals. And it's probably the case that needs to be happening, not just with each family and each client, which it does, but it also needs to be happening at the organizational level and the field level. Like what is significant change? So I think I just took us down one of those rabbit holes, Matt.
Oh, excellent. We'll have to. That is such a huge conversation to have. I'd be happy to help host that because we could probably spend quite a bit of time. It's a topic that's come up, and it's usually come up in this type of kind of context. So it'd be well worth devoting an episode to it for sure. So it's a really important question, and all the again, I feel like I'm being brought. I'm in a time machine. I'm back in back in Thatch Hall, in my graduate research seminar. So the clinical versus statistical significance. I remember going over that quite thoroughly back in the day. So what about some of the other things, the conflict of interest, the side effects and things like that? When people bring that up as criticisms to this work, what are your thoughts when people talk about those as potential things that detract from the perhaps validity of the evidence base?
It's I think conflicts of interest, particularly financial conflicts, are a legitimate concern, and again, it applies to all disciplines. I've been trying to understand some of the criticisms of our research in particular, and I just find it kind of perplexing and almost as if there's kind of a double standard, because if I'm understanding correctly, the position that some of the critics take about ABA research is that anybody who's paid to provide ABA services or to provide consulting services to ABA service programs automatically has a financial conflict of interest. And therefore, any research in which they participate, that they've published, co-authored, or whatever, is automatically biased. And I think they're basically saying it should be discounted entirely, or at least, viewed with a lot of suspicion. So, for instance, there was an article by two special educators on this topic that I read recently, and they said that the conflicts of interest that they're asserting apply to all ABA clinicians and consultants who participate in research is that there are, as they put it, clear financial stakes as the researcher's employment is dependent on clients and practitioners perceiving ABA as an efficacious method. Well, let's set aside that ABA is not a method for the moment. If you follow that logic, it seems to me that then it's saying, well, no member of any profession who's practicing that profession is going to be able to participate or conduct research on interventions, because they have conflicts and that biases them and that kind of contaminates or renders worthless or suspect their reported report. So, replace behavior analyst there with special educator. So no special educators whose employment is dependent on people perceiving special ed services as efficacious are credible participants in research. No physician whose employment depends in some sense on people perceiving medical services as efficacious should participate in research, or we should really question that. I'm not getting it. I don't understand the reasoning here. And I think it begs a lot of questions like, if it's not the people who are trained and understand the intervention who are participating, who are legitimate researchers, well, then who does that research? Who would be sufficiently free of the conflicts these folks perceive, to satisfy them? Would members of their disciplines meet these requirements? I find it difficult to understand the reasoning there.
Yeah, it's almost it implies almost a duty to put forth an alternative, and to some of the papers that I've read in this area, I don't recall that happening. So I agree. Okay. I have I've held you guys over the time that I've promised here. So I want to make sure that are there anything else regarding the criticism of the ABA research that we want to get into before? I want to. How about the side effects, monitoring side effects during the injury?
Yeah, that's another thing that puzzles me a little bit. Again, of course, that's something all researchers should be doing and evaluating. And probably all fields could get better at, including ours. But, again, I think about it from a methodological standpoint. If you're going to be able to conclude that a certain adverse event was a side effect of your treatment, then your design and your measurement needs to be able to support that, right? What I'm hearing some of the critics of ABA say is that behavior analysts working in autism in particular should be reporting if their participants have sleep problems or eating difficulties or, any sort of behavioral difficulties that occur anytime in the course of the study, that those should be deemed adverse effects. Well, those are common behaviors in people with this population. Some would say their characteristics or corollaries to the very diagnosis. And so it's quite a stretch to say, if I'm working with a child or a group of kids to improve certain communication skills, and they're having sleep difficulties, they have autism. Many people with autism have sleep difficulties. So to conclude that those sleep difficulties are due to my communication intervention, again, I think there's a stretch here. I think there's some logical flaws in that reasoning. Again, that said, of course, behavior analysts should be looking for and measuring and reporting actual adverse effects.
I think the most charitable interpretation of that I can think of is perhaps, and this is I think unsaid but possibly implied. I don't know. You guys tell me, but is that like if a participant started and the intervention when under scrutiny, whatever independent variable that is, and then there's a very marked change in that individual sleep patterns, that would be perhaps a clinical concern that one would I would assume work out with the family and to try to do some additional analysis to figure out what is going on here. Is this is this actually a part? So I think that might be part of it, that it would just it would just be sensible for a clinician and a parent to try to investigate that and see whether or not that is a part of the intervention itself, or are there other factors contributing to someone's disruption in their sleep patterns. I'm totally speculating here because I'm trying to make some sense of this and approach it from as charitable as I can.
I think you're right, and those kinds of difficulties could be due to any number of factors outside of our intervention, outside of a study. If we're doing a study, they may be dietary, there may be a medication that they're on, and maybe simply things happening in other environments. That's why you need good methods to really evaluate that from a clinical standpoint. Yeah, and Jane, maybe you can say how you've dealt with this.
Well, I mean, I think if I were a clinician and this was a problem that was encountered by one of my families, and we would be trying to understand if in fact it had anything to do with the intervention, but probably moreover, we'd be trying to figure out how to solve it, right? That's where our focus would be. And so I was sort of thinking when Gina was talking, okay, does that mean that you have another group that doesn't get the intervention and you catalog the behavior problems or sleep disorders? But I think that too would be probably requires such a large N of folks. I think it would not be easy to do, but it's coming in the context of those are common problems for individuals with autism, and that we work very hard to try and address those. So I think it's It's a difficult one to sort of handle, and it's also in some ways harder to understand.
Got it. All right. Last question here. I'm curious to get your thoughts on is what are some studies that have yet to be conducted that you folks would feel that would, kind of, I'll just say it more simply. What are some interesting experimental questions as it relates to behavioral treatment of autism that haven't been addressed that you'd like to see addressed by the research community?
Oh, so many. To me, a real priority is evaluating treatment models. ABA, it's not a monolith, and even early intensive ABA, we know there are different models. Folks use different ingredients, if you will, in their models of early intensive ABA. So we've got a bunch of models. For example, people will use certain tools that are described as both assessments and program or curriculum guides to, select treatment goals and implementation procedures. Almost none of those have been evaluated in controlled studies that I can find, but they're being marketed as, effective ways to program for kids with autism. So that's a priority. There's, question now about how effective ABA intervention that's done mostly or only by parents or other caregivers might be. There's a little bit of research there, but probably not as much as needed. There are a lot of things I see people talking about, practitioners changing the way they're doing ABA intervention based on some sort of social concerns, things or, topics of conversation from anecdotal reports and so on. Boy, I hope somebody is evaluating the effects of doing things like not encouraging kids to make eye contact, little kids with autism, on how that's going to affect their development of critical skills down the road. Lots of focused ABA interventions that, there's so many of them that, still need to be evaluated. Those are just some thoughts off the top of my head.
I would just kind of add to that this is not exactly a research question or series of studies, Matt, but I think that we as a field need to get clear that there are different overarching goals of treatment that and different populations within the entire autism community. And we need to be matching our outcome measures and what constitutes meaningful change. There is to those particular goals of treatment and populations. It would be lovely, convenient if there were a single measure of outcomes. And I know in some ways the Vineland's been brought up, but we're confident that's not the right measure. I think the answer lies in having a much more refined series of outcome measures and goals that are really matched to what was the purpose of treatment. Was it to catch up to typically developing peers, or is it to remediate some skill deficits here or behavior problems here? It's got to be matched to the goal of treatment and to the population and to the intensity of treatment that's been provided. So I think getting better at being able to talk about that is, and maybe, that there are a number of groups that are starting to work on this, but I think that's the big challenge ahead, and I'm really interested in seeing how it progresses, because I think it's going to be essential to providing good services and to communicating what the value of those services are.
Great, those are really important questions. So, thanks for sharing those, and more generally, thank you so much. I'm just very grateful that you guys took a couple hours out of your day to chat with me and by extension, the audience on these really important matters. So all that to say, I very much enjoyed this conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt, for having us.
Same. Yeah, we really, it's so important, I think, to have these discussions and get information out through various media. And I hope I understand a lot of people listen to your podcast. So I hope you get good audience for this particular episode. Again, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.